Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the structure of what we're going to do today and introduce the series while people keep rolling in. Well, first off, I'm Dr. Michelle Harwell. I am a graduate of the Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis and a training and supervising analyst. I also own a group practice in Northeast Los Angeles. And training a lot of young emerging clinicians is a big part of what inspired this series. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But how we're going to do today is I'm going to be talking with Estelle for about an hour in a very casual conversational style. And then in the last half hour, so Pilar, I think you gave me back the host for some reason. Yeah, sorry, we're having a little technical issue. Let's see, I think someone got kicked off. All right, so we're gonna have a Q&A session for the last 30 minutes. And you can submit your questions either via the chat box throughout the program, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A portion to have more lively questions asked. So we'd really like to invite you in for that process. So let me talk a little bit about what inspired this series. I have benefited from relational psychoanalysis myself. I think going through the candidacy at ICP and my own personal analysis really expanded the borders of what I could know, feel, think, and really changed how I could hold in the complexity of what I could hold in the clinical setting. And I've been passionate for years about training young clinicians in relational psychoanalysis. And I've really come to know that there are a lot of barriers of access to knowing the power of relational psychoanalysis, some because of the history that, I think there's a lot of confusion around the lineage of classical psychoanalysis and where it's evolved. And I think there's a lot of barriers of entry in terms of power, privilege, hierarchy. And so the impetus of this course is to do a couple of different things. One, offering a free community space to interact with relational psychoanalysis outside of institutes is one, but also to do it in a conversational style and a relational style. So you'll just hear Estelle and I talk, hear about her history and hear about the person and behind the ideas. So you really get an experience of relational psychoanalysis and a chance to ask questions. I want to invite you all to, this series is designed throughout the summer for you to come to as many or as little classes as you want, but I encourage you to participate. There's different themes we're engaging, but we're also engaging a diverse body of minds. And so there's a lot of, I think, goodness in tasting each of the way and the uniqueness and the creativity of each of these analysts and how they approach, how they think, and how they feel into what relational analysis is. So I hope you enjoy this series. We're kind of making it up as we go, so hang with me. I've lost my second in command. I don't know, Pilar, are you here? This is a part of the emergent property of relational psychoanalysis, moving with things on the fly. So I have someone who's supposed to be monitoring the chat box, and she is not currently here. Give me just 1 second. She's having trouble logging on. Oh my gosh. There's a maximum amount of participants. I can't join any longer. Well, that is something. Okay, we're gonna roll with it.
Right.
We're going to roll with it. Okay. So Estelle, I am going to introduce you and then we'll start chatting. How about that?
That's great. Will
So
we just whole screen like this, or is this the way the screen is going to be, or?
yeah, this is the way you can go into speaker mode. If you hit speaker, and it'll, for anybody who wants to be, thank you, Justin, I appreciate that. So we will record this and release it to the public so everybody can see if there's, so you're in speaker mode now, thank you. Sorry for the dysregulation. Okay, let me introduce you, Estelle. Estelle Shane is a founding member, board member, and training and supervising analyst and faculty at the Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. She is founder and board member of the International Association of Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology and advisor for the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysis, IARP. She is on the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Inquiry and Psychoanalysis Self and Concept. She has published numerous articles and has co-authored one book. Welcome, Estelle. So glad you're here. So can you tell us, when did your story with psychoanalysis begin?
Well, it's an interesting fact that my story of being in psychoanalysis came like midway in my career, pretty far along, because when I went to school at UCLA and I got my doctor. I had young children, and the deal with my husband was that I could go to school for as much as I wanted because I had supported him through medical school. So I'm in UCLA. I'm getting my first doctorate in English literature, and then I got a doctorate in education only because my doctorate in English literature got me nowhere. They explained to me they don't hire their own graduates, and I couldn't travel because my husband was in practice here. So I thought, well, I might as well get a degree in education because maybe then I can get a job in some way, which is what I did. I got my degree in education, and I was hired by the Center for Early Education to set up an elementary school, which I knew nothing about elementary schools or education, but my degree allowed me to apply for, and I got the job, but they said to me, it has to be a psychoanalytically oriented education for our elementary school at Center for Early Education. I said, what's that? And they said, that's your job to figure out. And so I applied for training at the Los Angeles LAPSI, it was Los Angeles Psychoanalytic Association Society. I applied for a training there and loved my training. I mean, I loved the fact that I was learning about psychoanalysis, although that's a complicated story too. So I ended up just not staying very long after I started the school. I worked there for about 5 or 6 years and remained on the board, but I began to go full-time into psychoanalytic practice. So that's my story. The training in psychoanalysis was an enormous disappointment for me because I thought that I was going to be educated more intensely about the things I learned in the novels of the 19th century English literature, where I felt I got to know people, I got to know how people thought and felt, and I thought, boy, psychoanalysis will give me even more of that. But it wasn't like that. My first seminar was a Kleinian seminar. Someone came from England and presented a case which was all about the analysis and nothing about the patient. I thought, this isn't going to teach me how to be with people. And then my courses were 2 years with Freud. So I felt, when am I ever going to learn how to be with people? Because this was totally new to me. But I began my psychoanalytic training with cases in both child and adult. I had child and adult training, which meant I had 6 cases in control analysis from the very beginning. So it was a very fast course for me. That part I loved, just loved. So that's that.
That's where you began. I hear so many things. One being my own path in psychoanalysis is very nonlinear. I started as a English literature major, and I think there's so many of us who are inspired by the human story and back our way into psychoanalysis, and it makes sense. But I'm so struck by the statement you made that you didn't, in your first training, you didn't feel like you were equipped to be with other humans or learning how to work. Can you talk more about that?
Well, the reading was, and the discussion, the seminars were strictly Freud. And I loved it. I mean, I loved reading the theory of Freud. I loved learning it. I loved learning that history, but it got me nowhere closer to people. My first supervision was with an adult patient, and my supervisor said to me, I'm going to teach you about transference. So the patient comes in, he lies down on the couch. You say, I want you to tell me what comes to your mind. And then you sit silently and wait. And the patient begins to talk. And he starts talking. And somewhere in there, he pauses. And when he pauses, you say, I notice that you've stopped speaking. You wait. The patient says something, maybe. And then you say, I think you stopped speaking because something came to your mind that you didn't want to say. And then you say that, and I followed his instructions with my patient. And then you say, I noticed that you stopped talking, that because something might have come to your mind you didn't want to say. And I imagine it was about me. And my patient that I tried this out with turned around and looked at me and said, are you also shrinkocentric? What makes you think I'm thinking about you? And that was my beginning. And I thought my supervisor wasn't going to be very useful, I could tell. And after a while, I just stopped telling him what was actually going on. I more tried to please what he wanted me to think was going on, because he was teaching me about transference, and that was the exclusive center as far as he was concerned. My patient wanted to tell me about him, not me. It was interesting. It's a big learning experience for me. But I had good supervisors for the most part. They were all very different. And I think that was the way I learned something about how to be with patients. But my main lessons were from the patients themselves. They turned out to be the best teachers of all about what it's like to be in the world of another. Real privilege. And I've always felt and continue to feel it's the best privilege one can be offered by
sacred work we do. Yeah. Estelle, you kind of are leading a little bit into the next question I have, which is, as we move towards hearing more of your journey in self-psychology, before we do that, I wanted to hear, I hear embedded in your first training, maybe that there were some basic assumptions about humanity, about growth, and I wondered what your first training taught you about its basic assumptions about healing, growth, and the human condition, and how maybe that's different from where you ended up heading.
Well, but Michelle, it's so interesting. You understand this because you too studied English literature. I entered into the idea of psychoanalysis with an idea about what I thought about human beings. I thought human beings, if they're loved and treated well and responsibly throughout their childhood, will grow up to be able to both connect with themselves and connect with others. And that was what I felt was, a basic assumption I had about what it would be like working with human beings when I actually got a chance to do so. My first experiences were, as I say, the first class was a case conference, and it felt so alien to me, because I remember he said at the end of the instructor said at the end, during the course of the treatment, he got married and had a child, but we never talked about that. And we said, as a class, well, why didn't you talk about that? Well, because it didn't enter into his dreams. And everything that I've talked to you about, everything I know about this patient came to me through his dreams. So that's what I learned at the beginning, that it wasn't anything conscious that you were particularly supposed to listen to. You were to listen for unconscious connections, unconscious associations, make the patient's unconscious conscious to the patient. That's what I felt. That's what I was taught it was about. My patients, as I say, became instructive for me because they seemed to want to talk about themselves and what they knew about themselves, which was not exactly what I was taught to anticipate. I can't explain it. It was very strange. And I felt like I was in a blind person moving through trying to feel my way into what other people as patients were like. And they were much more like, as I say, the literature I read than the courses I was taught at that beginning stage in psychoanalysis that I was in.
Yeah. I mean, maybe part of what I hear is something around how if we don't hold our theory lightly, it really shapes the experience of how we experience others. And like that the presuppositions and the ideas about technique and where we're looking to find something can lead out in front of maybe what the patient is trying to tell us. And that was kind of maybe keying in your first training, was more a relationship to technique than or theory than person.
Absolutely. You put it very well. It's exactly right. And that's why I felt like my training was my secret, that what happened in my training, which was what happened with patients, was secret to me, and that what my instructors talked to me about was a whole other world of theory, which, as I say, I loved theory. So it was fine. I loved learning theory, but it didn't have much to do with what I was doing. That was my primary experience.
Mm-hmm. So then what was the turning point that you knew something different was needed? When did you start contemplating and playing in the playground of self-psychology or moving towards a more relational approach?
Yeah. Well, mainly, the major influence on me was my husband and I had a best friend, Arnold Goldberg. Arnold Goldberg was a candidate, a upper level candidate working with Heinz Kohut. Heinz Kohut was beginning to teach at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. And the people he assembled around him were not the people he had considered as friends, the people that were his peers. And he was, after all, president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. So he was deeply involved in psychoanalysis and in American psychoanalytic training. But when he began to develop his own ideas, the people that were interested in what he told them, what he had to teach, were the candidates themselves, the upper candidates. And among them were people like Mike Bosch, Arnold Goldberg, John Ghetto. John Ghetto was actually his first lieutenant, and then Arnold Goldberg became his second first lieutenant. So Arnold came to visit us. He was never married. He hadn't been married for a while, and he would come alone and spend time with us. And one day we were in San Francisco, and they had just started the bumper the bumper sticker craze where bumpers were stick, and he'd never seen that before. So he ordered a bumper sticker that said, let's see, the self is a separate line of development. That was what he asked to be put on a bumper sticker. And we said, what are you talking about? My classically trained husband and my classically trained self. And he said, and then he started talking about, you guys, you can't know what you're missing because you're not in Chicago and you haven't met Heinz Kohut. But if you met Heinz Kohut, it would be very important and earth-shaking for you. And he invited us to come to Chicago to a birthday party that Heinz Kohut was giving for himself. And Heinz Kohut had given Arnold permission to ask us to come. So I got to hear and see and recognize Heinz Kohut in this social setting that he absolutely owned. They were all the people deeply influenced by him at that beginning stage. And we were very turned on by him. I loved what he said. I loved the way he talked. I love the fact that he could start a sentence and then about 2,000 words later end the sentence, but come up right where he should at the very beginning of the sentence. So he actually made sense with these long, convoluted sentences that he spoke. I thought he was the most brilliant speaker. And I began to really be interested in what he had to say. I'm still in my training and analysis. My analyst hated that I was busy with Heinz Kohut. Why would I bother with that when there was so much else that was on offer? But he asked us to present a panel, present a paper at a panel through Arnie Goldberg, just because we knew Arnie Goldberg. He asked us to do it. We wrote something, and what Heinz Kohut would do, this was the second international meeting of the psychology of the
And what year was this, Estelle?
Gosh, what year was it? It must have been 60s, something like that. I should look it up. I promise you I will. I don't remember.
That's okay.
But it was the second annual conference of the psychology of the self. And we were asked to do something. What Heinz Kohut would do when he was present at these conferences was to, at the end, take the podium and then go over the whole program and say, I like this is what I liked here, this is. And when he got to our paper, he said, I didn't like this paper. He said, you tried to make a connection among Piaget, Mahler, and me and form a developmental theory. We had asked you to form a developmental theory, but we didn't want Piaget and Mahler to be a part of it. You could never put me in the same, I don't know how many of you remember Margaret Mahler, but at the time she was very large and it was separation, individuation. And I said to him when he was castigating us at this big conference, I said to him, look, in a letter you wrote to Margaret Mahler, you said, we are both working on the same thing. We are just coming at it from different sides of the mountain. So we wrote a paper that showed you coming at the same thing from different sides of the mountain. He said, no, it didn't work. But he liked us well enough to invite us to join his little self-psychology study group that met in Chicago once a month. So we had to go to Chicago once a month to attend the study group, which was a real privilege. And so that's how I got to know Heinz Kohut and self-psychology. That's how it began.
Wow. Wow. So what were the clinical attitudes and what were you encountering as you kind of deepened your connection to Heinz Kohut and self-psychology? What were you beginning to learn about the theory contrasted with more classical approaches?
The thing that comes to my mind when you say that is Kohut said, he said something somewhere, I don't remember where it was written, but he said, very often when I'm talking with my patient and I feel I'm absolutely right about something. If I stop and think, I discover actually the patient was more correct than I was about this. I thought, oh my God. And I told my training analyst, I said, can you imagine you saying that? I can't imagine you thinking I was right and you were wrong about anything.
Yeah.
You know, I said, that's what I like. When he asked me what I like about Kohut, that's what I loved about Kohut, that he knew that this is really amazing to me. He knew how to listen to the patient. He didn't have in mind what he was going to say or what should happen or what he should expect in the interchange. He really listened to the patient. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
So I loved empathy. I loved the concept of empathy. And, you know, when Kohut, the last speech Kohut made before he died, 3 days before he died, he said, I have to talk about empathy again. He said, I've been talking about empathy all my life. I'm tired of talking about empathy, but no matter how hard and how long I try to explain what I mean by empathy, you guys, you just don't understand it. He said, empathy means to enter into the world of your patient and hear the patient from his perspective. Look at the world, stay in the world of the patient from the patient's perspective.
Yeah.
That was amazing because
Yeah.
I remember when his paper, he wrote Empathy, Introspection, and working through that first big paper he wrote before he became a self-psychologist. He said, analysts all use empathy. And I thought, no, they don't. They don't use empathy. They listen to the patient from the outside. They don't listen to the patient from the inside. That's what I loved about self-psychology.
Wow, I have so many associations and questions just right here. One, I hear this sense, the revolutionary sense of the flattening of a hierarchy of authority that so much of, I think, early psychoanalysis kind of was predicated on a certain kind of knowledge that the analyst is imparting, a way of knowing. And, you know, Kohut's idea of listening, introspection from the inside out, and privileging the patient. There's a kind of deep wisdom and trust in what the patient already knows that we're trying to work together to elucidate. And I guess I wonder if you could talk more about that idea. Well, and I'm getting excited, so all my ideas are colliding at once. But I want to say that in my training, it was in the self-psychology class with you that my idea and my experience of empathy really expanded in knowing how intricate and how long we can hang out with our patients to elaborate and understand even more deeply than I ever understood. And I think self-psychology introduced me to that. So I'd love to hear more.
Well, self-psychology definitely opened up, like you, Michelle, was for me, it opened up a whole new world, actually, a world that was inhabited. I mean, I had tried myself to listen to patients, but I listened to them from the outside, the way analysts did. The idea of really paying attention to their internal worlds and actually restricting your own vision to the vision presented to you by their inner world was just such a marvelous thing. But I wondered, you know, I asked Kohut this. I asked Kohut this question: at what point do you begin to talk with your patient about another's perspective, somebody else in their lives perspective, or your own perspective, rather than just their perspective? And he said, you don't. And I said, wait, I said, I have a patient that I wanted to ask you about anyway. This patient came in my office. I'd been working with her for 4 years in my really first enterprise at listening and from a mirroring perspective to a patient. And she was very deeply engaged with me in that way. And she had done very well in professionally, but socially, emotionally, she didn't make much progress, I felt. And she came one day and said to me, I'm so furious with my friend. She was supposed to give me a shower for my birthday. She was going to give me a party. I'm an orphan. I don't have parents. It was so exciting to have someone give me a party for my birthday. And then she came to me and told me she couldn't give me the party. She had to erase it because she was pregnant. Her doctor said to her, if she doesn't stay in bed and take care of herself, she's going to lose the baby. So she can't give me the birthday party. And I was so furious with her. And my patient was so angry. And she couldn't hear anything else but how angry she was. So I said to Kohut, at what point might you say to her, look, I know how you feel. I know how meaningful this is to you. You know, the empathy part. I understand exactly why this is such a hardship for you and why you're so angry. But I can imagine you can imagine your friend and her state, her needing to, she wants this baby and she wants to keep this baby. And so she has to give up the party. She must be regretful too. You can imagine that. Or you can imagine how she feels. When would you say that to the patient? And he said, never, never. And I thought, uh-oh. Thought there's something missing here. And that's when I decided that self-psychology was wonderful insofar as it offered us wonderful tools like empathy and introspection and the patient's self being the center of concern and aggression as reactive frustration and defenses as protections, not against the analyst, but for themselves. All those Kohutian ideas I thought were invaluable, but it's not enough. You can't expect that narrow a view would be enough for a full therapeutic process with a patient. And that's when I began to think that relational analysis was very important and that relational self-psychology came to be the center of my interest.
Yeah, that's, I think that the importance of being able to kind of take in the best of what something offers, but also continue to kind of grow our experience in mind. And I think I was thinking about Fasagi's kind of listening positions and other-centered, analyst-centered, patient-centered.
Exactly. Well, Michelle, you're talking, you obviously have gone through ICP and have internalized everything that ICP tried to teach you. That's exactly right. These areas of interest in other theories and what they can offer us seems incredibly important to me. A narrow learning seems cheating the patient if you just keep to a certain limited scope. So yeah, taking it all in, using what you feel is useful in the particular moment with the particular patient at this time seems what we need to do as analysts.
And how do you feel like the field of self-psychology has evolved and is evolving?
Well,
Stuff.
I think that from my point of view, a self-psychology that limits itself to what I would consider the 6 basic concepts of self-psychology as a way to work with patients would be insufficient. You really have to. And I think relational theory in its broadened umbrella is really invaluable to the learning we have to do. So for me, self-psychology has to expand. And I'm sure it has expanded for different self-psychologists in different ways. For me, and for people that I work with, it's relational self-psychology. It's a self-psychology informed by relationality and relational principles, but maintaining the core essence of Kohut.
Yeah. You know what it makes me think, and this is even part of this series, kind of thinking out loud, is that, I hope that a number of our audience don't know much about Kohut and self-psychology. So when you say the 6 principles, so, you know, what does that mean? And when you say relational psychoanalysis and what it's expanded, I certainly know those concepts, but maybe you could illuminate a little bit what you're talking about in the 6 main principles of self-psychology.
Oh.
Teach, Estelle. Teach us if you can.
Empathy, I've talked about empathy, listening from an empathic perspective, the self being the center of our analytic concern, always. The self-object transferences that emerge in development and then emerge again in the analytic situation. The twinship, the mirroring, and the idealizing self-object functions that emerge in childhood, according to Kohut. Those are his developmental principles, but then reemerge in the analysis of a patient. If you treat the patient from a self-psychological point of view, they will develop a mirroring transference or an idealizing transference or a twinship transference, just because these are our basic needs that emerge from the individual, both in childhood and in analysis. So those are the self-object transferences. And there's the fact that aggression is reactive to frustration and deprivation. It's not a basic drive. It's not a force that is in the individual. The potential for aggression is there, but aggression as an emergent force comes through when there's deprivation and frustration of the individual. Defenses as reactive to the need to protect oneself. It's a protection. It's not something against the analyst. It's not something against the analysis as was defined in classical theory, but it is something to protect the self.
Yeah.
And then that psychoanalysis is a developmental process rather than something that stops at the Oedipal phase, as in classical theory or object relations theory. It is something that goes on throughout life, and that the developmental process in a psychoanalysis begins where the patient has had trouble in development and will continue throughout the analysis, taking patient through the different needs and places in his life. And, the idea of termination, to me, is really a misunderstanding of what psychoanalysis is. I think what we have is certain interruptions when we finished analytic, when we gotten to a point where we can proceed in our life and in our loving. That's good, but you might have to come back into analysis. It isn't something that, as Freud thought, once stopped was forever gone. It's something that you might return to as issues come up in your life that need to be worked through. So it's a lifelong process, which was what Kohut taught.
Yeah.
That's it. I think that's 6 principles.
Pretty great. That's pretty great for on the spot lecturing. So you're sharp. I'm struck by, I really like thinking about presuppositions that are implied in theory and how they situate ourselves relationally. And I'm sensitive to this in training a lot of young clinicians who I think are anxious about knowing something to offer something. And in doing so, I think they can confuse needing to be something, offer something, and their competency is often tangled up in progress, right? And I think it colludes then with this ability to be introspective and understand what a client may be asking or needing of us. Does this make sense? And some of the presuppositions of, I think, self-psychology make that easier to understand non-defensively as the analyst. Does that make sense?
I think that's very well said. Yeah. Yeah, Michelle, I think so too. And you had asked what, in your other question that I went through the long self-psychology, you said, what about relationality? Well, what relationality does for me, see, Kohut had a one-person model. He really did. He thought there was one person in, as he said, the consulting room, the patient, and the analyst was there only as a function to provide twinship, to provide for the patient's twinship needs or mirroring needs or idealizing needs, there as a function, not as a person in his own right. It was definitely a one-person model that Kohut thought was important. What I love about relationality is it's a two-person model. There are two people, and I think it's the relationship between those two people that, to me, is the answer to how does analysis cure? Kohut's question, how does analysis cure? I think it's through the relationship. I think it's through the fact that two people come together and share intention, attention, focus for the period of their work together as two people, not as one person, not as patient analyst, but as two people working. And, I think what you said before, Michelle, is very important. It's a democratic idea. It's not an autocratic idea. Kohut, for all his good things, was autocratic in his approach in a certain way. There was a patient and an analyst who had a function, but the analyst didn't exist in the relationship as a relationship. Relationality brings in the other, and the other is quintessentially important to each self in that two-person relationship. That's important to me. And to me, without that, you don't have a real therapeutic connection.
Yeah, that feels so potent. Estelle, could you put some flesh on that for us? Is there maybe a clinical example or way you could kind of position what maybe a more one-person psychology, even from a cohesion standpoint, would feel like versus the same scenario approached in a more relational manner?
Yeah. So remember, I brought up this patient that I went to see Kohut about, because when do you tell her about? His model is really, I had this patient, I was absolutely treating her in the perfect cohesion manner. She was in a deeply held mirroring transference, self-object transference. I responded to her as if she was the person in the room, not me. She was there. I was there as a mirroring self-object function, a la Kohut, and she did very well for 4 years. But again, I saw her as so limited in her growth, in the sense that professionally she did brilliantly. She, really gained in her self-esteem, her self-knowledge. She felt good about herself. She felt she could talk to others as herself, and she became a real leader from being someone who was new in her professional field. She became a leader within that 4-year period, but no friends, no real friends, no real contacts, no love interest, she was just exclusively involved in her self-development. And I felt that relationships are very, they may not be as important for everybody as they are for me, but relationships are very important, even for someone like her, who has to deal with others in the world and who really wasn't doing a very good job of it. Witness her inability to see anything in that person offering her a party than the fact that the party was on or was not on. No real sense of the other. And I felt that was truly missing in my limited self-object work, self-object transference work in the province of self-psychology. when Kohut said to me, never, when I asked him, when you do this, never, I thought, well, I'm on my own now because this isn't going to work for me. And I went back to the patient, and I started talking to her about what I felt was something that she might feel about the others around her and stuff like that. She says, what's happened to you? She said, you've become a different person. And I said, yeah, I have. That's true. I said, I really begun to think about what I felt was missing from the very good work that you and I were doing. And so we went on from there. But that was the beginning for me, Michelle, because I began to recognize that it's the relationship that is important, not the self-object function. That's important, but it's not the only thing in the relationship. It's a part of the relationship. It can't be the whole of the relationship. And that other things were important. Context was important. The things that relational theory teaches us about self and other is important.
Yeah, yeah. I'm struck by the sense that in your otherness, showing up, you're offering the patient an intimate opportunity to negotiate desire and limitation and know something about, that so much of relationality has to be experienced and practiced, and how excruciating that can be when there are, developmental traumas that exclude someone from knowing how to engage to get connected up with others, and how vital then it becomes for the analyst to participate in that process with the patient.
Exactly. And this patient who I call Amy, because when I talked to Kohut about her, I wrote about her, but this patient that I call Amy was totally deprived of relationships with others because she had no siblings, because she had no other family, because her mother committed suicide when she was 15, because her father died in an automobile accident when she was 18. And I saw her as my orphan. Not that I enjoyed that feeling. I felt burdened by it, but I felt she was my orphan. She had nobody but me. And that was perfect for her. She liked that very much, but it felt to me like that I needed to help her expand, just as you say, Michelle, how to be an other with an other, how to interact. And to me, psychoanalysis in a relational self-psychology way is so much about the connection between the two of you and what you learn from one another and how you grow.
Yeah, yeah. It's reminding me when I kind of put this course out into the interwebs to market it. The quote I attached to it was this Adrienne Rich quote about an honorable relationship is violent and delicate. It's two people refining the truths they can tell each other to break down self-delusion and isolation. And that so beautifully to me describes relational analysis. It's
wow. Well, I'm so impressed with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, Adrienne Rich, there you go.
She's so good.
Yeah. I wonder, Estelle, could you say something about, I think part of this course I want to think about too is that, where relational analysis is heading, if you have any ideas about either barriers or stagnations or stalemates, or what are areas that need more tending to or conversation around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think what relationality is doing, relational theory is doing now, and witness the last this relational conference in Spain that they just did, which I didn't go to, but which I know the program of, was very much configured around the context in which we live. I think context has become so that it's no longer two people, it's all of the ways in which those two people are influenced by others, and the world, the country they live in, the world they live in, all the influences, that becomes a part of the consideration when you think about what should be included in the analytic relationship. It is an appreciation for the expanded context in which we are all living.
Yeah. I think that's so important. I think speaking to the sociocultural, I think this is part of a younger generational's hesitation around relational psychoanalysis, that I see a younger generation emerging and saying that the sociocultural, race, identity, power, privilege, these are things that we're in the soup of, and that they have to be acknowledged, that we're not in a vacuum with people when we enter into the consulting room. And I think that that's part of what I hope to be in conversation about in part during this series. But I've noticed, some of the suspicion and hesitation about relational psychoanalysis is kind of the lack of attention that has been paid to this area for a long time. And I think, conversations are burgeoning, but it's been a long time coming.
It has been a long time coming. We're such, we were so, and I'm so guilty of this. I understand it's the preciousness of the relationship, and you forget the context. And, so that's why, when you look at what the program of the relational conference was, and what the program is going to be upcoming for the self-psychology conference in October, there's so much more importance being given to the surround, and how the surround always and inevitably influences each and every one of us all the time, which I didn't really understand, but which is now becoming increasingly clear.
Yeah. It's interesting because something is sticking with me of something you said when you were in your first training, and then even with Kohut, there was a privacy to the conversation of when your own hesitation started, like, some of this is for me and then some of this is not. You continuing the conversation of, like, that there's more to understand and know, and you went off and pursued it. And it seems like at every journey, psychoanalysis, we're always kind of learning and expanding the borders as a thinking community, right? And I think that's psychoanalysis, is we're trying to expand the borders of what we can think, know, and feel together. And I think this piece of the sociocultural is really pivotal to welcoming in a more diverse body of clinicians who can participate, right?
Right, absolutely right. And I think your series is I think these people, you all, are so fortunate to be given this series by Michelle, because it will really introduce you to the thinking of lots of very different people, all of whom have something very valuable to say. And you can collect wisdom as you go, which is what you do as a psychoanalyst. I mean, we never ever stop learning as psychoanalysts, because, even if we just engage in teaching, as I did for a while, self-psychology, it has to be expanded. You can't be satisfied with any limited presentation of theory. You just have to know more. And that is so helpful in working with patients, because patients are all so different. There's 100 million billion neuronal connections in each human brain. How could we all not be extraordinarily different one from the other? And that's important for us to remember and know, so that we don't think we have learned it all when we've learned one series of courses or another. We don't.
Yeah. Well said, Estelle. Well, we're about to our Q&A. I want to give people a chance to do a couple of things. I want to ask Pilar, are you here? Did you make it back in? Okay.
Back on.
Hi. So Pilar, will you explain just how we're going to do Q&A for people so they can get a chance to be thinking about their questions?
Sure. So you all, hi, everybody. It's nice to see so many people and some people I even know and recognize. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand or raise the icon, and I'll just kind of scroll through and see who has a question. You can also, I don't even know if you can chat to me privately, but if you can and want to, you can do that. But otherwise, in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll kind of be looking out for you.
And I would say, I have a couple more questions for Estelle, but I want to make room for all kinds of questions. They can be more theory specific, more Estelle specific, but also I don't want younger clinicians to hesitate to ask the questions on your mind, more basic questions, even that this is a space we really want you to feel free to kind of get to know relational psychoanalysis. So Estelle, I think my last question I had for you before we kind of turn over to the Q&A was what 3 books you would recommend, or any kind of reading, or what's kind of what's of interest, what's kind of hot for you right now that you would recommend for us.
Okay. So for me, the most important book I read for expanding my understanding of psychoanalysis was Stephen Mitchell's Hope and Dread, which is an old book. I mean, of course, Stephen Mitchell is dead, long dead anyway, but it was an earlier book of his, Hope and Dread, which to me introduced exactly how psychoanalysis grew and then needed to continue to grow and what was necessary. He asked in that first part of it, 3 questions. What does the analyst know? What does the patient need? And how do you put those 2 things together? And I think that's what relationality did for me, was put together what do you know? What does the patient need? And how do you put the patient's needs together with what you know? How do you expand that? And it's a very good book, I think. And then another that I love is B.B. and Lockman's Infant Research and Adult Development, because I am a developmentalist, and I do believe that so much of what we encounter in the analytic relationship is based on early experiences in the patient's life. And I think B.B. and Lockman give us a lot of that. I think Standing in the Spaces, Philip Bromberg, I love that book, and it's a very good relational book. So you might notice I didn't mention anything written by Heinz Kohut. I don't believe that, I mean, I loved How Does Analysis Cure, but I don't think anything that Heinz Kohut wrote, except for maybe that book, tells you what self-psychology is. As well as a lot of papers that he's written, kind of conveys to you. So I guess if I were to add a 4th book, it might be How Does Analysis Cure? That's Heinz Kohut's last posthumously written book, actually edited by Arnold Groberg, my friend. So
lovely. Those are really rich suggestions. We're getting a lot of questions. Pilar, do you want to or do you see any? Well, why don't we actually start? Should we start with a live question, Pilar?
Yeah, I think it's Elaine Gerstein. Do you want to jump in? Okay. Can Elaine Gerstein?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
there. You hear me now? Okay, so I'm sorry you cannot see me. I don't know why. I was most interested, of course. I mean, I learned a lot already with a very beautiful conversation and explanations. I have to set myself. I am not a psychoanalyst, not even a psychologist. I'm more like a patient, but a patient who knows a lot, because I am or was a conference interpreter at many international psychoanalysis conferences. So, of course, being an interpreter translating from English, German, or Italian into French, I had to understand what it was all about in order to translate accurately, have the terminology, of course, but also mainly understand. So now, so you know, I'm not, it's not new to me, but it is very new to me, both. I'm not sure I understood the relationship part. Do you mean all relations of that patient you described, who obviously didn't have, you said she had no social life, she's a, I could compare myself to her, but let's not. But, or do you mean the relationship strictly between the patient and yourself and the psychoanalyst?
When I spoke about Amy, that one? Is
Yes.
that what, yeah. I meant she had no connections with, she really didn't. She was good at getting other people to do what she wanted. She was absolutely, she failed in getting to understand or be interested in or care about the other. She really didn't.
No, how about in general? How about in general? You attach more importance to the relationship between you and the patient as a mirror or a twin or whatever, or is there more to know about the relation of the patient to the context of the whole world?
Oh, well, because that has to be part of the conversation, you know. Yes, I think all relationships are, all the patient's relationships are of interest. And of course, the patient has some primary relationships and they become of most interest. But yes, the whole way in which the patient interacts with the world that surrounds her is important, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. All right, Mike, would you like to ask your question?
Mike O'Brien.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes, Estelle, thank you so much. I've learned so much. If I could record this, I'd watch it 20 times to learn even more. But I want to ask a question about something that was very important in Kohut's theory, and to me in Kohut's theory, about transmuting internalization.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And have you had experience of seeing that happen in your clients? Does that play a role somehow in how you understand relational therapy?
That's a very good question. Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up. Transmuting internalization is the notion that we learn from the other, not identical to what the other is or does or has taught, but you transmute it, you internalize it, and it becomes something you own and something that you make a part of yourself. That's transmuting internalization. And yes, I think that a person who you work with over time becomes able to make whatever that you've had to offer a part of themselves in a way that is unrecognizable in terms of the form in which it was first conveyed. And I think that happens all the time with me. I mean, I take in, but I don't identify or identically take in with what other people say. It just becomes part of the transmuted way in which I internalize what I learn from others. I think Kohut's gift was that, one of Kohut's gifts was that concept, which I keep forgetting about when I talk about the basic concepts. Important, because what he was talking about is the way analysts will practice being analysts rather than internalizing and transmuting that whole concept of how to be a person with another person in that role. Very important.
Yeah, that's so helpful. how to embody humanness,
Yeah, right,
right?
right.
Rather
So
than
that it's not recognizable as somebody else's humanity. It's your own, right? Yeah.
I am seeing a great question from our one and only Joe Shalene. He is asking Estelle about the name. Let's see. If you unconstrained by any kind of constituent group that may have a certain commitments to a name or concept, what would you prefer to call the version of psychoanalysis that you are articulating if you took it up to coin the new terminology? So does that make sense?
Well, Joe, Joe always makes sense, but I think that is what I mean when I say relational self-psychology. It is a self-psychology, which I deeply respect, but broadened, changed, imbued with very significant contributions from relational theory. And relational theory is so broad, it takes in so many different perspectives, encompassing them all and just making of them this great appreciation for the connection between two people, the relationship. So I don't know, Joe. I think that would be what I'd call it. What would you call it?
Are you asking me?
I'm
Or
asking Joe.
Yeah, let's put Joe on the hot spot because I don't have an answer to that. Joe, if you want to pop on or in the chat, we'd love to hear your idea. Hi, Joe.
Hi, I'm not exactly TV friendly, but I think my kids are about to come storming in. Yeah, I remember you talking about the change of the Self-Psychology Journal from the Journal of Self-Psychology to content.
Yeah.
I'm blanking on it. And like you were describing earlier, that even our ideas of self have changed so much to be so much more interrelated. Just whether that was something that you would want to change, or you still want to give tribute to the self-psychology part of it.
What would you, Joe, what would you say? Oh, look at that. What would you say, Joe?
He might be in the mix of things, so maybe we'll put a pin in that, and maybe we could go to Bradley. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi there. Hi, Miss Estelle and Michelle. I am so interested when you were talking about your patient, Amy, and when you had some countertransference about this way she was dealing with her experience. And I always think as a young clinician, how frightening it is for us to, we always get so concerned about hurting our patients' feelings. And we have the leading edge, right, of which Kohut, the positive potentiality of a symptom, but there's also the part that bites us in the ass, right? And that we have to somehow convey that to patients or we don't have a full analysis. Absolutely. And can you say something more about, when we feel a patient is ready to, I'm not going to say confrontation, but to hear about something that is really useful for them to hear about the way they are socially, or their demands of other people, or the things that indeed bite them in the ass. And so when is a patient ready? When is a patient ready for that? Or is it more just a sense of feel that you can say it and it's just catch as catch can? You take a risk and say what you need to say to the patient to see how they can handle it or metabolize it. And then do we have rupture and repair and so forth and so on? Could you say more about that, Estelle?
Of course, and thank you for bringing in rupture and repair. But also, what I think is that when we're in the process of working with a patient, you never know. I never know. I have no clue as to what's going to come up, what's going to emerge, because it really is a two-person process, and something emerges between the two of you that, at least as far as I'm concerned, you can't predict, you can't plan for. It just comes. And so, but you might take out of the out of your work with them, an idea that this really is something that needs to be addressed. And with, for example, with Amy, the fact that she really wasn't concerned with others, that she was so focused on her own experience that she's missing out on the experiences with others. I think when you become aware of that, it becomes something that impresses you. You do find yourself saying it the first time you get it. It seems appropriate to have it emerge. And as far as disruption and repair, that is really fertile ground for disruption and repair, which is not, as Kohut, and I forgot, it's another basic concept. It's not something that Kohut would avert. He thinks it's essential. He felt that you could only really change a person through disruption and repair. It's only through something that comes up between the two of you when the patient stands back and has to manage himself or herself for the moment that change can happen. He felt change happens through disruption and repair. That was his view. I don't think I agree with that. I think change happens moment by moment, the way it does with an infant in the going on being of being with the person. Change emerges in both directions, actually. But he felt change came from disruption and repair. And so therefore, he says you shouldn't deliberately disrupt the analysis. It will happen in itself automatically. It will always happen. But when it happens, it's a great moment for development for the patient, because the patient then has to take on for himself the problem that came up between the two of you and make some effort at repair of himself. And that's development as far as he was concerned. Does that make sense?
A wonderful sense. I'm thinking that your patient wasn't able to mentalize other people's perspectives, right? Amy, she wasn't able to do that. And so whatever it was that you said to her, hopefully helped her to consider that over time. And
20 years.
Right. Really quickly, the other thing that I think is interesting with rupture and repair is that when a patient can confront the analyst with their feelings and the analyst can apologize or at least own their part of it, that can be really life-changing as well. So
absolutely. You begin, as Kohut would tell you, you begin with the apology. You begin by acknowledging something that is truly something you can recognize as your fault in this rupture. And then you move into whatever repair. Yes, absolutely. It is.
Give them a new experience.
Yes, that's right. It's what I would call a positive new experience, which is the best kind to have, right? Right.
Yeah. What it brings to mind for me is that I think that when someone in development isn't engaged with feedback, the kind of shame and fear of relationality and the kind of what can get touched when we can be in an intimate, honest space where there's kind of a mutual exchange of honesty and feedback that then can hold the self-esteem and identity more robustly. Yeah.
Again, very well said, Michelle. I agree with you.
We've got several more questions. Let's see. Someone is asking, how do we integrate the surround with the intrapsychic? I listen for both because context is everything, and it makes the intrapsychic, the past patterns, illuminative. And the surround, as highlighted, is increasingly complex.
How do you integrate the surround with the intrapsychic?
Yeah.
And I think that I think really that happens when you're paying attention to what you imagine is going on within the patient's mind. Not because it's something the patient has verbalized to you, but something that you can infer because you've been listening and you know this patient and you can imagine this is happening. And you say, I wonder if you're thinking that. And then you can bring in, I bring in, I say that because of what you were telling me about the dinner that you went to the other night. I mean, you kind of, the intrapsychic is interesting because it is connected in its own unique original way to what the patient had been telling you about also in terms of the life with others. And it's important to bring it together. I agree.
Estelle, someone is asking, these are, I'm working off a document, so I'm just trying to make my way so I can name the person. The last one was Carolyn Schaefer. This is from Mari Rose. Could you give an example of how you would offer supervision to a therapist who is working with a patient who persists in an unsafe relationship after the clinician has offered empathy, really tried to understand why the patient is attracted to this relationship and reflected this, explored the function of the relationship, reviewed the patterns in the relationship and how it mimics dynamics of childhood? How do you stick with patients who march towards disaster? That is a wonderful question. And how many times my clinicians have been in this situation, well, myself too. So tell us, Estelle.
What comes to my mind instantly is what Kohut said to his patient who came into the office bragging about how he had driven to the office and missed that, nearly missed this and nearly missed that and nearly missed that because he wanted to get there quickly. And there he was, and he was very proud of himself. And Kohut said, I'm going to give you the deepest interpretation I have ever given you. You are a goddamn fool. That's what he said. That was his way of suggesting that maybe there's another way to drive than the way that patient was driving with such pride in himself. I think that it's always difficult to, but you know, when you're in the connection with the patient and you feel, and you're feeling that something they're doing is really dangerous, I think the best thing you can do is say, look, this is what I'm thinking about what you're telling me. And then you say it. I don't think you avoid it. I think you do say it. And I think you say it with the kind of modesty that, you know, that suggests that you don't know everything. You're just, this is what you are feeling and thinking as you hear. And you just want them to know what you're worried about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that and what I hear implied in that, Estelle, is like, I often think about how rounds of experience people need and that what our concern might be and what they may be kind of playing out are on different trajectories, and that doesn't stop us from speaking it. But the dual reality I hear is you're speaking what's on your mind, but you're also not making it contingent on the relationship, maybe is how I'd say it, is that they're feeling that this is what I'm thinking, and that the not knowing part is an invitation to stay in relationship and observe. Yeah,
exactly. Both. Yeah. I'm not pretending that this is what's on your mind. I'm just telling you what's on my mind, but I'm hoping that the two of us can talk about it, because to me it seems important. What do you think? You know, that way.
Yeah. Let's see, there's two raised hands on Chal. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but if you want to.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Estelle, for this talk. I'm so grateful for this space. I am joining from India, so it's almost midnight here. Sorry, I can't put my video on. So I have a question, and I'm an early career therapist, so you can make that out by my question. So again, I practice in India, and relationality here is different, because we're also talking about context. It's important to recognize that, well, we are a deprived nation, and we feel deprived not symbolically, we feel deprived psychically. So a lot of time relational work is to give abundance of care and love and empathy, which we all have been deprived of. But I have also had supervisors who tell me that I don't frustrate my patients. I don't I don't let them be frustrated or get angry. I'm struggling. I don't want my patients to have therapy as something they have to recover from. But I also see what my supervisors are saying. So yeah, I mean, any 2 cents would be really helpful right now.
That's
Well, I tend to agree that frustrating, depriving our patients is not a great way to help them. But obviously, you have to allow them time to develop what they think of as their needs and to express them to you. So yeah, you have to allow the time that it takes for a person to know what it is they're not getting as well as what it is they are getting from you and be able to ask for it. Maybe, do you have an example of that for us, or
like if well, very recently I have this patient that I've been working with, and he was talking about the Me Too movement, and I think everybody is, most of us are aware of it. His ex girlfriend wrote a post about him during the Me Too movement, explaining, or I would say just describing how she felt molested emotionally and physically. And he was talking about it as a matter of fact that, oh, she wrote this post and I don't know what is she talking about. And I almost reflexively asked him, is there any truth to it? And he had a moment of breakdown. He was like, how can my therapist not trust me? And I had this urge to, come to this rescue of this baby who's breaking down. I know, so many layers to it, but yeah, that's one moment where I feel I could have let his feelings get more intertwined and frustrated, but I just again was acting from my own maternal transference, I believe.
yeah, I think that's right, that you kind of feel your way into where there's a need to wait and where there's a need to move in. And there's, obviously there's no rules to that. It's just something that you can feel. And, the thing about what the work we do is it's wonderful in that we can make mistakes and then we can repair the mistakes. It's, it's not one false move and you're dead. It's one false move and you reflect and you think and you discuss and repair. And repair is, as Kohut thought it was the road to cure. I don't think it is necessarily the road to cure, but I think repair is really important in the relationship too. So waiting and then doing and then waiting is part of what we do.
It's
Yeah.
Estelle,
Thank you.
thank you for that question. I think what you're saying is so profound, like in some of the simplest things we do seem simple, waiting, but I love that terminology. It's not one thing and then we're dead. It's one thing happens and then we reflect and then we repair, right?
Right.
Yeah. Here's another question. How can relational self-psychology integrate and work with psychosocial realities such as racism, sexism, classism, trans, and homophobia? Big question.
Which is what we're all studying right now. I mean, it really is what is emergent in the culture and that we're all paying attention to. So how can you, I guess another question would be, how can you not? I mean, we're kind of in a world now where it is making a lot of noise and demands on all of us, on all of our time. And so I think you take it in as you feel it in. It's all such a matter of, for me, always and forever being in the moment with the patient and seeing what emerges in either of us as we're in the moment together. And so often these days, the issues of whiteness, of LGBTQ plus matters, all of that is very much in the context of some patients. For some patients, it feels to me like they're living in a world in which they are removed from all of that. But for most people, it does come in, and when it does, that's when we let it in. I wouldn't bring it in. I don't bring anything in. I just see when it emerges what it resonates with in me.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that is a great question that I think it's going to be important to ask each of our different speakers in the series to see how they might interact with, and from their different positioning and location, how they might think about integrating psychosocial dynamics and how they recognize them, how they work with them, and how they integrate them into theory and how they move clinically. So thank you, Sophie, for that question. Let's do one more and then we'll wrap up. Karen Anthony.
Hi, Estelle.
Hi.
I trained in a different tradition, which is the Kleinian Bionian tradition, and so much of our efforts when we're in the room with the patient is focusing on projective identification. So focusing on our inner world and the impact that the patient may have, the subtle impacts the patient may have on that inner world. I know so little, if nothing, about self-psychology and Kohut, but the way you described it, it was like for him, he was making this huge effort of imagination to enter into the world of the patient. So it almost sounds very, very different, that there was a kind of a going out of the self and into the world of the patient, whilst in projective identification and countertransference in the tradition I was trained in, there's this inner looking focus. So I was wondering if you could say something a little bit about that apparent contradiction and whether Kohut had anything to say about that.
I don't think Kohut had anything to say about that, but I think it's one of the things that, for me, relationality taught me, that first of all, patients influence us. That's so important to really focus on and think about. I don't know that that is really much a part of what Kohut taught us, but that I learned from relationality, that and from, obviously from object relations and from projective identification. The idea that the patient not only influences us, the patient needs to feel that the patient has influenced us. And the projection identification is, I guess, the evidence for the analyst that the patient has been influential, has touched, and that has to be brought in. I think it's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, so I want to just a couple of things as we're wrapping up. One being the registration is open for our next two classes. Our next one is going to be with Dr. George Bermudez on community psychoanalysis. And we're going to be talking about exclusion and how psychoanalysis has kind of making psychoanalysis more available and why it hasn't been. And so Dr. George Bermudez will be up next. And then we're going to be talking with Dr. Phil Ringstrom, who studied with Stephen Mitchell, and we'll be talking about the roots of relational psychoanalysis. So we started here with Estelle, discovering some of the roots of self-psychology, and we'll be returning to a historical lesson with Phil and relational psychoanalysis. Thank you all for being here. Estelle, thank you so much for giving your wisdom. And you can register. Sorry, there's a question about how you can register. On the original link, there's an event. We'll send out links so you can register. How about that? We'll keep it easy. So thank you. Estelle, any final words or anything before we end?
I love this experience. It was really fun. And I'm feeling envious of all the ones that are coming after me that get to do this with you. You're so good at this, Michelle. I want to thank you for your really great competence. I wonder if you know about everybody else's ideas as much as you know about the ones I introduced. It's invaluable. And I really appreciate having this experience. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Thanks for sharing your heart and wisdom with us. Until next time, everyone.
Bye.